On December 26, 1996, JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in her own home. To this day, we still do not know who is responsible for her death. Some have said it's an intruder, some have said it's the Ramseys themselves, and that sparked a lot of media coverage over this case, my channel included. But that's led to a lot of lawsuits, a lot of settlements, and a lot of court cases from the Ramseys suing media outlets over their coverage of the case, and especially when naming them as the people who were maybe responsible for the death of JonBenét. And so in today's video, we're going to go through a number of these media cases and see if this was just simply the Ramseys trying to defend themselves, or it's a campaign by the Ramseys to quiet any differing opinions from their own. Welcome back to the Midnight Report, and let's just get right into it. There are a number of cases that we're going to be going from 1999 all the way up until about 2016 with all of these different lawsuits. And one thing that became very clear to me is there's been a lot of discourse about how can we look at relevant sources. For instance, I use Steve Thomas quite heavily in my documentary. Is he a reasonable source to use? And we're going to look at his book specifically because there was a whole different law issue over that book when it came out, but it's still able to be sold to the public and read and even quoted in documentaries. So we're going to look at a lot of these settlements and kind of come to an opinion on what the Ramseys are doing over all these media cases. So the first lawsuit I really wanted to talk about was from The Globe. It is a tabloid. They had made a story suggesting that the parents had killed JonBenét and more or less covered it up. This was eventually settled out of court, confidential terms, and believed to include monetary settlements. And that's one thing you're going to pick up from in this video is that a lot of the times these were settled out of court. And a lot of the times we do not know the details. We don't know how much money was paid to the Ramseys. We don't know the terms. We can only go off of sources, which the other part of that is a lot of the times you're not going to be able to talk about a settlement on what actually were the terms. That's usually part of the deal. So right away, you kind of see here that the one big thing that the Ramseys have is they have a great law team. They are upper class. And I know that John Ramsey says they were not upper class and that they were running out of money and all this stuff. The thing I really look at that and go, I mean, they were doing a bunch of lawsuits that ended up gaining them a ton of money. They were suing companies for millions and millions of dollars. Now, do I think they were getting everything they were asked? No. I think that, for instance, if they're asking for $60 million, they probably didn't get that. They might have gotten maybe a couple million. And then you got to factor in, okay, how much did that go into paying the lawyers? So it's hard to look at, but one thing that really gets thrown out there is that the Ramseys definitely used their influence and their wealth to kind of assert themselves against some of these media companies and to get some money. Now, one thing I want to point out, I believe that yes, if you are a media company or you are somebody publishing something and you come to your conclusion and say, these are the people that did it, and not in my opinion, this is what actually happened. Yes, you are definitely able to be sued because you are not saying that it's your opinion based on all of the facts that you have. You are straight up saying that it is them and there's no reasonable doubt. That is why in my documentary, I made it very clear throughout multiple points whenever I talked about anything to do with the Ramseys being involved or any of that stuff, I made sure to say, in my opinion, or based upon what I've seen, the most likely outcome or probability would lead to maybe the Ramseys. Because that is a legal way of trying to protect yourself from getting sued. Because you're saying it's in your opinion. You're making it to where you're not presenting it as fact, that this is exactly what happened. You're leaving it up to interpretation, which is free speech. Everybody's allowed to have their own opinion. So that's part of it. Now, another thing I want to point out when we're looking at these cases earlier on, the internet is really not a thing all that much yet. So when you're getting to later into the 2000s and you're getting to the 2010s, what really starts to happen is a lot of true crime podcasts start to begin, or you have the internet where people are allowed to give their opinions and you can't silence all these different people. That's one thing that I think has really added to this case is that we've been able to have so many different people give their takes and go through the facts and present their own ideas that it's grown larger than what it used to be. Back in the day, it was you got a lot of your news through the newspapers, through television, through magazines. That was the way that information would travel. And so back then, there was a lot more misinformation because you couldn't verify things as easily as you can today. And I will say this, even in this case, very hard to verify everything you're being told. I have a mistake in one of mine, which is a big one, and I feel really bad for, but I thought the call that John Ramsey made to have them leave happened a little earlier than it did. That was not the case, and so I was told that in the comments, which was great. It helps me understand the case better, and that was a big sticking point for me. I still think it's really suspicious, even if it didn't happen, before the body was found. It happens like directly after. It's still really suspicious, but that's the point. Like, it's really hard to find information and then verify it. So that's a big part of this. So moving on, then we had a couple of different lawsuits that would then happen as the years go on, looking at 1999 and 2000, and it would start to ramp up. You would have a sue going against the New York Post, the Star tabloid, and the reason that they were sued was because of defamation, accusing them of directly or indirectly labeling the Ramseys as guilty. And the outcome were that some cases were dismissed, others were quietly settled. The Star and the New York Post were among those that settled. So again, you see a lot of settling out of court. And why does this happen? Because if you go to court, the thing that's going to happen is have huge legal fees for both the Ramsey side of things and then also for, well, the New York Post or any of these other media companies. And so it might just be more profitable for the New York Post to just say, yeah, that was a mistake, we shouldn't have done that, whatever, and then just settle out, because then you don't have to pay as much as going through maybe a 8-month trial or in court about who is right and who's in the wrong. And for the Ramseys, the same thing applies. If the Ramseys were struggling financially, you would want to settle kind of as quickly as possible, like get any type of money you can and also silence their opinion on what they thought happened. So in my opinion, I think the major conclusion that you come with for these first opening cases, and this is also the time period where John Ramsey, apparently they were not, it seems like they were broke or whatever, like he said in the Crime Junkie interview. This is only 3 to 4 years after JonBenét Ramsey's death, so maybe they still had money to be doing all these sues and stuff like that, but they were definitely getting money. That's the point I'm trying to say. Like, they have already within, a couple of years of JonBenét Ramsey's death, they've sued multiple different companies, outlets, and they definitely got money back for that. Of course, lawyers take their cut from that. But as of right now, none of these are really going to, judges deciding what's going to be the outcome. Like, none of these are really going forward to that. As we get into 2000, we see a lawsuit against Court TV and also Fox News. The Ramseys sued Court TV commentator Nancy Grace, Fox News, and others. The reasons were for statements on air suggesting the Ramsey guilt, and in these cases, they were either dismissed or settled without trial. So once again, none of these are going to trial. All of them are being settled because it makes sense. And this is all kind of a build up into our main one, because a lot of these ones I brought up, we don't have a lot of information. They were settled behind closed doors. We can infer that there were some monetary transactions going on here in which the Ramseys were gaining money for, this articles or these people saying these type of things on, TV. And that was what was happening. So at this point, as we get into, I think, the most important one, which happens in 2001, I want you to keep that in your back of your mind, that as of right now, the Ramseys have not taken anyone to trial. The Ramseys could have gone to trial with any of these people if they really wanted, as much as they could, and if they wanted to publicly put that person on blast instead of doing the settlement, they could have. They chose not to. So we then get into 2001, which to me is the most important one of this entire video. The Ramseys made a lawsuit against Steve Thomas, a former Boulder detective, in the case for JonBenét Ramsey. I used the book JonBenét Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation quite heavily. It is the book that Steve Thomas wrote, and the reason that the Ramseys ended up trying to sue Thomas was because Thomas suggested that they were guilty, and specifically Patsy was the person that killed JonBenét. I don't necessarily agree with Steve Thomas's outcome of what he thought happened, but based on what he says, he believes that, based on all the facts that he looked at, it was the most likely case that Patsy did it, and then there was some covering up going on between the whole family. I totally understand that. And one thing is, for this video, I looked at going back to when this was all happening, Steve Thomas, and when he was interviewed more or less about his book, when this trial was happening. He comes off as very honest, in my opinion. Like, he comes off as somebody that stood by his opinion and wouldn't back down. He was somebody that I think felt very honest. Like, when he was being asked questions, it wasn't something where he'd sit there and think for a while. He seemed to, respond right away. He didn't seem like he had anything to hide, in my opinion, which is it's refreshing when I watched that interview compared to when I watch a John Ramsey interview, because they're completely different. Like, John Ramsey, a lot of the times he'll, shift the topic, or he'll, wait a while to answer a question, or he'll say something else to give him time to think about answering the actual question, or he just won't answer the question at all. You never see that about Steve Thomas, which is why I believe John Ramsey is a little suspicious in the way he does interviews. And what we saw was that the two parties settled. We do not know what the settle was. All we have from this settlement is a little bit from the Ramsey camp, and then we also know what Steve Thomas said publicly in a letter afterwards. So this is a relevant quote that we ended up getting from the Ramsey camp on why they ended up suing Steve Thomas, and their whole purpose of it was. So this is the quote. They sued this case as a matter of principle, Wood said. A man wrote a book accusing Patsy of murder and John of covering it up, and profited off a child's death. And win, lose, or draw, they were not going to tolerate it. Now, I want to point this out right away. I don't think that Steve Thomas wrote this book for profit. He seems to be very passionate about this case, and even as the years have gone on, Steve Thomas has, for the most part, gone silent. He is not involved with this case anymore. He has completely, it seems like, put it out of his mind and moved on. Because he can't prove it, because this case is not being solved, he seems to have just moved on. He doesn't talk publicly on this anymore. He's not on documentaries or anything like that regarding this case. So I don't think his purpose behind writing this book was for profit. I think it was for getting out what he believed truly happened. And I think that is the case. Now, do I think Steve Thomas might have gone about it the wrong way and really opened himself up to a lawsuit? Probably. I mean, he is very much, when you read his book, you can tell he's very much accusatory towards the Ramseys, and I totally understand why. You know, like for instance, some people do not like the way that I have talked about John Ramsey in those interviews, and it's kind of because I've done all my research that I've prepared for this case. I've looked through what I think happened. And so by the time I'm getting to these interviews and I'm reacting to them with you guys, I have an opinion already formed of what I think happened. I'm trying to give John Ramsey the benefit of the doubt, but there's obviously things that are going to come up when I'm looking at this interview and it doesn't add up to what either was said to have happened that night or what I believe to have happened that night. So that I come at it from a biased point of view almost because I've already done my research for the case. The same can be kind of applied to Steve Thomas here, where Steve Thomas in his book, you can tell he's definitely leaning towards the Ramseys, and I don't blame him for that at all. But it does open you up, especially at a time period like this, where there wasn't a lot of media that could, talk about that or write books on it. Like there isn't YouTube. You can't go to YouTube and go, JonBenét Ramsey, what happened? And you would have hundreds of thousands of videos. That's not the case here. So you open yourself up to a lot of criticism and lawsuits. Now, I will say this. The Ramseys side of things say that John was profiting off of a child's death. Wasn't the Ramseys also doing the exact same thing? They would write a book on the day JonBenét, died. And can I understand why they wrote the book? Yes, they want to try and clear their name and they want to show people why that they are innocent. But at the same time, it wasn't like that book wasn't making money. Those books were making money. It helped John Ramsey and the family. So this whole idea kind of comes off as, in my opinion, hypocritical because the Ramseys did the exact same thing, even if it was for different reasons. They still profited off of JonBenét's death in terms of the book. So I kind of don't understand this quote from that point of it, but I also get the idea that, yes, you have to sue Steve Thomas because he's accusing you of all these things. So from the other side of it then, Steve Thomas comes back, and this is what he says in his letter after we'd already seen the settlement. The frivolous lawsuit filed by the Ramseys has concluded. I'm sorry for this delay in making a public statement until now, but the Ramsey announcement of a resolution in March was premature. I am bound by the terms of the settlement to not discuss its conclusive points, but I can tell you this. It was a thoughtful, deliberate decision. For the record, I was not the one who sought out a settlement in this case. My absolute requirement for any resolution was the mandate that I would admit no wrongdoing whatsoever, nor would I personally pay a single dollar in settlement. And that is exactly what was achieved with this resolution. In fact, the book can continue to be published, advertised, quoted, and marketed. I will continue to speak on the case whenever I wish. I continue to stand resolutely by my book and the opinions I expressed in it. My beliefs have not changed. The reality was this. I was well within my constitutional rights to have stated my opinion regarding the events surrounding this murder, but this was a civil case. It was about money. Justice and doing the right thing do not always prevail in these cases, as we all know. On the other hand, we would have enjoyed deposing and taking people in front of a jury and discovering the truth. Unfortunately, financial constraints continue to prohibit this, as I was in no position to take on the Ramseys' wealth. In fact, I lost my house and savings during the struggle. After almost 6 years, I can now look forward to a much brighter future. I continue to receive a warm welcome and tremendous support from police around the country. Although I miss police work and have had my invitations to rejoin law enforcement, I have respectfully declined. I'm taking my life in a new direction and I'm enjoying it with people I care about. Again, I want to reiterate that I personally paid not one red cent, not one thin dime, and not one single dollar to settle this suit. I tried to the very end to take a principled position in this tragic case, and I believe I have done so. That was from Steve Thomas on August 6th, 2002. And I think the clear point of this is that Steve Thomas would love to be able to go into court with the Ramseys because he believes that he could maybe expose their story and all of that kind of stuff. But the problem that you see from Steve Thomas, he's only an individual. He is not one of these big companies, and he has much more personal involvement in this case than anyone else. But the simple fact is, Steve Thomas does not have the money to go against the lawyers of the Ramseys. They are some of the best lawyers in the country protecting the Ramseys, and also the Ramseys have money. I know John Ramsey likes to discount that, but from everything I've seen, they had money. And so when you look at the idea that they settle out of court, we don't know exactly what was happening with their settlement. That's the same thing with all of them. Steve Thomas saying he never paid a cent, I find hard to believe. I think what he means personally is like he himself did not pay anything from his own personal money in terms of the settlement that was given to the Ramseys, because likely what happens is when you publish a book, you usually get insurance on that book so that if you are sued for your opinions or whatever, your publishing company then will take that on. That seems to be the most likely outcome, is that likely the Ramseys made some money off of the publisher of the book, but not actually Steve Thomas himself. So that is what I think likely happened. Now, the one thing that I think you can tell right away from this letter is Steve Thomas, after this moment, is done with the case. He, doesn't want any part of it anymore. He made his peace. He said what he thought happened, and he's moving on. He's getting out of law enforcement. And so many people have looked at Steve Thomas and gone, is his information reliable? And the one thing I will look at here with Steve Thomas's book and go, what is his rationale to lie? That's the thing, is so many people point to the idea, well, maybe this stuff didn't happen, or maybe he's lying, but what's the reason for him lying? What vendetta would he have to falsely accuse the Ramseys and all that kind of stuff and come to wrong conclusions for what? Was it just to sell a book? No, it doesn't seem to be the case at all. If it was just to sell a book, he would have continued trying to milk this case. Instead, he instantly stepped away from the case, likely because of how demanding the case was financially, talking about having to sell his home and all the financial struggle that he faced because of the Ramsey lawsuit. I personally believe that Steve Thomas is a very reliable source. Given the way he comes off in his interviews, given the way he would have had access to all the information, and given I don't believe there's really any big motive. So Steve Thomas just wants to take down the Ramseys, what, because they're rich and they have connections? That just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, when Steve Thomas was writing the book, could he be very biased towards his own opinion and maybe really hammering in on factors that back up his theory but don't go in on other ones? And that's the thing, right? I am somebody that has a differing opinion than Steve Thomas does. I don't believe that Patsy was the one that killed JonBenét and everything that happened there that he suggests. I vary from that. I don't think that was the case. I do believe, in my opinion, based on probabilities, I believe the Ramseys were involved to some extent, but not exactly to what Steve Thomas says. So I think what's great about Steve Thomas's work is they can provide you a lot of background into what was going on in the police department during the days and the weeks in investigation for JonBenét's killer, between the DA, the police chief, just the police in general. What were their overall thoughts and feelings as the case was in developing? I think Steve Thomas does a really good job in his book of painting, who the characters of the Ramseys are. There's things that are great about his book that are really noteworthy, but I come to different conclusions than what he did. So I think Steve Thomas is a really important one. I do think that the idea that, again, his book is still being able to be published and it was not silenced, it wasn't really stripped from the internet, any of that stuff, tells you a lot. It tells you that the Ramseys did not have, in my opinion, as strong of a case as they believed. Because if they did, the book would have been taken down, all that kind of stuff. But in reality, this case didn't really do much for Steve Thomas's book and all that stuff. If anything, all it did was it sent a message to him like, do this again and we're going to take you to court again and you're not going to have the money to pay for it. That's the way I read it, is that the Ramseys are just kind of using their connections, using their lawyers, and using their money to pretty much silence anyone that's having any differing opinions from them. That's the way I've looked at this. And I know people are already going to be screaming and shouting in the comments. They're just defending themselves. They're just protecting themselves. All that kind of stuff. At what point do you go to, okay, you can't sue everybody that has a differing opinion than you? That's the way I look at it. Like, if you want people to stop being on your back all the time, try and make people understand why you did the things that you did. Now, Patsy, unfortunately, she's already passed away, so it's just John who's getting older and Burke now. But that's the point I look at it. It's like, these actions paint you in a very negative light because nobody's allowed to talk differently than you are. Nobody's allowed to have a different opinion than you do. And if they do, they get sued and they can't beat you because you have more money than them and you are able to have the best lawyer care, where someone like me or you, we are not going to be able to afford the best lawyers in the country. So that's the way I look at it, especially early on with these lawsuits. And we're going to talk about a couple more. I'm not going to talk about them too much because they're kind of all in the same idea, but during the Steve Thomas case, that wasn't the only one going on. In 2001, there was another lawsuit against American media, and they sued them for the publisher of the National Enquirer, and the reason was for defamation in multiple Ramsey-related stories, and the outcome was they settled confidentially in 2002, and the terms are undisclosed. We do not know what their settlement was. So again, you have a settlement behind closed doors. The Ramseys very much do not want to go to trial. They do not want to go to court. And so it was settled out of court once again. That's what the common thing is for all of these is that all of them seem to get settled way early. And you have to be thinking it's in the best interest of everyone. True, to some degree, right? But not one of these went to further on. It just is kind of weird to me. Moving on, in the same year, we then have a lawsuit against the Atlanta judge and police. They sued several law enforcement figures for mishandling leaks and reputational harm. This never went anywhere as the cases were largely dismissed at early stages, and so these ones didn't even go to settlements. These ones were just dismissed just completely. The Ramseys really had no grounds on their suing. And by 2008, so a few years after all these lawsuits have kind of come down, they kind of set the precedent, right? Because now if you're a company and you're like, let's make a story on the JonBenét Ramsey case, you might be going, well, should we do that? Because the Ramseys sued how many people before, how many different media companies? Let's maybe avoid this. And that's what you really see. You don't really see a lot of the talk of this case start to ramp up until the early 2000s, and it really gets sparked by 2008. So 2008, we know that the Boulder DA clears the Ramseys. So District Attorney Mary Lacey formally exonerated the Ramseys based on DNA evidence, and in my opinion, this was not the right decision. A lot of people have criticized her for this. I think it was way too early, made no sense to clear them. The DNA does not clear them, in my opinion. Too many innocent reasons, and also partial DNA. But that gets us then into the last little part of this. So getting then into 2016, this is getting a lot closer into the modern era. YouTube had started becoming a thing. Not as much. It was still in its early infant years. It was still growing, but you were starting to see it. And true crime has definitely gotten up to be much more popular as the years have gone by. But he sued the CBS producers and experts involved in the docuseries The Case of JonBenét Ramsey. Dr. Werner Spitz was also sued for suggesting Burke killed JonBenét. Reason, defamation, of course, that's what all of these were. And I want to make this very clear. Burke was the one who sued them, not John. That's very clear. The outcome was Spitz's lawsuit was settled confidentially in 2017. Once again, another settlement. And then for CBS, they initially dismissed at trial level, but parts reinstated on appeal in 2019. And in 2021, the case was settled confidentially. So the CBS one specifically, really big company. This is, again, another company is also going to have great lawyers. And eventually the case was settled, but it took a while. I mean, it took, 5 years for this case to really go away. It was one where they kind of battled back and forth, but eventually was settled. So again, we've gone through a number of media cases, and it's just become clear all of them end up being settlements that are really out of the public eye, that we don't know a ton about. But it does seem like monetary gains for the Ramseys, at least, like some payment was from the one company they're suing to them. And that's kind of what we've seen throughout the years. Now, one thing you'll kind of notice is, as we've gotten further away from the case, the talk of the case has not died down. I would say almost the talk of this case has gotten louder. Like, I think there was a gap in which the case wasn't talked about all that much, probably in like the mid to early 2000s, and then the early 2010s, like that gap, I think this case was kind of quiet. It was kind of in a dead lull period. And then because of things like, well, the Dr. Phil doing an interview with Burke kind of brought it back to the public eye. A lot of people started getting more back interested in it. YouTubers started making content on it. You got the crime junkie, you've got casual criminalist, you've got, think of any major like true crime person, they've probably talked about this case. This case is everywhere now. So I think it's become, part of it is that there's so many people with so much influence that are getting thousands to millions of views and eyes on this case that you can't silence them all. And at what point when you're the Ramseys do you see this and you go, okay, well, some new person is making some sort of content on it? Do you just go, we can't do everything here, we can't quiet the entire public, it's just gotten too big? So for instance, my channel, I've only made 3 actual videos on this channel, and this channel is getting a ton of traction, which I'm really thankful for you guys. By the time this video comes out, we'll probably have gained almost 100 subscribers since the last video came out, which is crazy to me. So thank you guys all for that. And let me know what you guys think about the way that the Ramseys handled the media, with people claiming it was the Ramseys suing them back. What do you guys think about that? Do you think it was them just defending their side of things, or do you think it was controlling the narrative? Do you think it was more the Ramseys trying to silence people that had influence and were telling different opinions than their own? What do you guys think? But I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.